communication. We just started recording. I'll rewind. Kiran is a doctoral candidate and teaching assistant at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, University of Wisconsin-Madison. A critical digital ethnographer by training, her scholarship largely explores the links between social networking sites, digital affordances, childhood and adolescent experiences, and social identities. She's a fellow at the Muslim Women in Media Training Institute at the University of California, Davis. She has co-authored 2 books, Challenging Discriminatory Practices of Religious Socialization Among Adolescents, Critical Media Literacy and Pedagogies in Practice, and Raising a Humanist, Conscious Parenting in an Increasingly Fragmented World. Those sound like great reads. Our second presenter, Miranda McKee, is a researcher, curator, and public programmer whose work focuses primarily on photography and visual literacy. She's currently a graduate assistant at Lakehead University, where she pursues an MEd in education for change with a focus on social justice. She lived and worked in the United Arab Emirates for over 10 years before recently relocating back to Canada. And Andrea Gambino, our third presenter today, for 10 years has worked as a public middle and high school English and social studies teacher in North Carolina, earned her BS in middle grades education and her MEd in new literacies and global learning at North Carolina State University. And she's currently a doctoral candidate in social sciences and comparative education and a teaching assistant in the education department at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Go Bruins! Her research focuses on K-12 and post-secondary educators' philosophies and practices of critical media literacy in the United States. You can see the amount of wisdom and curiosity and intellectual creativity that is in presence today at this session. And so I'm really grateful to hand over the session to our brilliant panelists. Kiran, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Anand. Before we provide a brief idea of how we conceptualize this session, what were our considerations when we were thinking about designing this session, I would like to emphasize that this session is more like a deliberative space. We really want to invite insights. We want to invite people to share their experiences so that we can take with us a great deal of contribution that has come up in the field. So when we were thinking about this session, the first thing that came to mind is, what is the role of digital technologies? What is the role of social media corporations to a large extent? There has been compelling evidence suggesting that social media corporations promote hate, incivility, misinformation, and political unrest to a large extent. And these big conglomerates, they always prioritize profits over public welfare. The users know so little about the algorithmic processes through which their information and the content they produce is used for profit making. There have been studies and there have been media reports, investigative reports, which have initiated discussions about how digital technologies are extremely biased at the level of coding and machine learning processes. And this enables the discrimination of already marginalized groups in our societies. So this session was basically conceptualized with the intention of complicating the role of media education in an age that is dominated by coding technologies and digital practices. The main question that we're trying to address or engage with is why has media education not fared well and to some extent failed to address these issues which are related to larger structures of power? Though media education encourages people to develop competencies to understand and critique media systems within the larger framework of governance and power relations, it has not succeeded in providing a very robust framework to engage with or to question media corporations playing a critical role in the creation of these technocratic realities and conditions. So in this session, we will spend time demystifying the productive associations between media education and the paradigm of neoliberal citizenship with the intention of identifying strategies, identifying experiences and practices of expanding on the critical potential of media education as a discipline. Media education for a very long time has been identified as a tool for educating individuals, equipping them with technical competencies that are required to use the developing technologies optimally. It has also been tied to this idea of neoliberal citizenship discourse, according to which a citizen must be trained to be an effective participant in a democratic society. Now, this emphasis on training and building the capacities of individuals has antecedents in the logic of neoliberalism, according to which an individual is granted complete autonomy, but also required to assume full responsibility for acquiring and developing the skills to negotiate with power structures. And according to this definition of the role of an individual, practicing citizenship largely requires acquiring literacy, competencies, and skills. So media education comes to become an increasingly a literacy tool to a large extent, which would equip individuals with whatever they require in terms of resources to make efforts in order to demonstrate and enact their participation. Also, to promote their media and digital technologies, the corporations have started using media education in their offerings. They emphasize that technology and literacy are two fundamental components of practicing citizenship. And the way media education programs are sponsored, how they are organized by these global media corporations, it legitimizes the process of, assuming responsibility by the individual as being integral under techno-capitalism. There's this very interesting paper that was published in 2016 by Druick in International Journal of Communication. And the author basically tries to understand what are the myths of media literacy. And I would really like to quote from that paper. So Druick basically writes, I quote, proponents of all political stripes support the essentially governmental imaginary that an educated subject will be protected against a destructive system thanks to guidance that will make them aware of the connections between knowledge and power. This approach aims to mobilize media themselves as democratic counterforce, presuming the vulnerability of corporate media to critique. However, corporate media culture, more pervasive than ever, has come to demand this critique, which at the very least serves to legitimize its self-proclaimed provisions of diverse choices on neutral platforms. Now, as a result of this, the discipline of media education has not made enough strides in decentering the individual and developing frameworks to analyze and challenge the proponents of techno-capitalism to a large extent. The dominant media literacy theories and frameworks have two overarching goals and objectives. It encourages individuals to develop skills, which are essential to operate and traverse the constantly changing digital worlds. And this would include discussions on how to become global citizens, to coding classes for young children. And there's an endless focus on technological skills, which ensure that individuals become better media consumers and producers. To ensure that social media platforms and other digital technologies can continue to be used as sites for data extractivism, corporations also try to create a dominant discourse where media literacy is marked as a prerequisite competency in a neoliberal capitalist regime. Now, such a regime encourages each consumer to only ever identify themselves as singular producers to ensure that the larger picture of big data production is not easily evident. In contributing towards online labor, these individuals are made to believe that they have autonomy to decide what they're consuming, how often, and for what purposes. And we all know that isn't true. Most of the things that we consume online or through digital technologies are heavily customized and predetermined for the consumers based on algorithmic and data-driven processes. The individual consumer is the producer and is a part of a larger collective. To wield the strength of a collective and a coalition is critical because coalitions and people-led movements encourage individuals to question, to critique and subvert larger power stakes in these processes of data production and circulation. So the neoliberal regimes reduce the role of media education to promoting the capitalist interests of the corporations by training us on the uncritical tropes of technological progress, optimism, individual autonomy, responsibility, and so on. Then there's always a second approach, which centers critical thinking. It draws theoretical and methodological strength from the critical paradigm, and it encourages individuals to use critical resources of practice, thinking, engagement, to question systems of power within which media, the content and the system are embedded, the discourse is embedded. Now, the limitation of this approach is that it works solely to a large extent in the register of thought and is limited to the individual. As it centers the individual, it also encourages people to question and think, but the praxis element at a collective level, at a social level, is missing. So critical approach to media education is limited in that it does not have a translational implication at the level of challenging, questioning these meta-structures of power. It has not made advances in developing action-oriented frameworks to hold the corporations responsible. Collectivities and coalitions can provide a very strong challenge to corporations. And so it's important that we think about practices of organizing and mobilizing against corporations, against techno-capitalism, to develop the power of numbers for social inclusion and justice. And this could be a very important advancement in the field. We argue that if media educators wish to detangle media education from the overarching influence of neoliberal thinking and practice, they must also demystify the role of media education as a classroom practice or as based and centered on individuals. Media education has the potential of becoming a mode of activism. It can be invested with translational implications, with a strong praxis element at a collective level, if media educators expand on their frameworks and include participants from beyond the classrooms and create something which is more grassroots oriented. Media education lies at this very potential intersection of regimes of thought and practice. There are so many ways in which we can shift the focus away from the individuals to the process of organizing at a large scale. And I think it's very interesting to think of what such practices of organizing would look like. It's interesting to think about these different modes of collective protests and engagement that are required to challenge large-scale influence and power of corporations. So it is time, I think, that we start to conceptualize media education as a tool of activism, a site for resistance, and a method in supporting public interventions designed to initiate social movements on a transnational and a global scale. My co-panelists will now continue this discussion further and provide insights from their research and practice to help us think of ways in which we can complicate and build on the existing frameworks and theories of media education. So over to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Karen. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. Thank you all so much for joining in, Karen, for offering these really important insights. So just as Anat was sharing with us, I'm going to speak a little bit more from the practitioner side and share a little bit more about the work that I've been doing alongside phenomenal teachers all over the United States and more specifically in California. Here we go. All right. So I have had the privilege and honor to be learning and talking with educators from K through 12 environments and post-secondary all over the country, and more specifically in California. And so right now the working title of my dissertation is simply called Educators' Journeys and Practices of Critical Media Literacy. It is still in flow and developing, so I'm hoping to hear some of your thoughts today, and I hope you'll be a think partner with me and with my colleagues. So first, I just wanted to share a little bit more about me and my positionality. I have some students and family in the audience, and so I would like to extend my sincerest gratitude to you. You all are my why for everything that I strive and hope to do. My work really focuses on both teachers' journeys and practices, what brings them to this work of critical media literacy, how did they get started, and what sustains them. And I'm also particularly curious, I've been doing this work in the crux of the pandemic and in the ongoing racial reckoning in our country that is far long overdue. And I am so curious how teachers are continuing to evolve as CML practitioners, as reflective practitioners as well. So here you see photographs of my family, my cohort on the top right, and then wonderful students at the bottom. So originally I was teaching in North Carolina. That was also initially where my research was positioned. But given recent shifts in North Carolina and the ongoing warfare against critical race theory and other critical theories of education that are occurring, I ended up repositioning my research in California. And so I just wanted to provide that context for everyone as well. And so as I've been repositioning my research and working alongside teachers in California, there has been a tremendous call for critical media literacy in grades 1 through 12 throughout. Resolution was recently passed on March 9th, 2021. And so it's been a really exciting time to be studying this work alongside teachers as this tremendous resolution has been passed. And as many of the teachers that I've been working alongside have been absolutely key and instrumental in this work to be able to develop curriculum, to lead professional development sessions within their school spaces, and to really share their ideas, many of them that have been doing this work for quite some time. And so I'm working with who I call, honestly, behind closed doors, the dissertation power squad. They're some of the most phenomenal educators I've ever had the privilege of knowing or meeting. And so I feel so grateful to get to share in their work with them. And so largely this work that we've been doing, we've been having interviews and conversations going through lessons that they've been using alongside their students, particularly in the past 2 years, teaching completely remote or hybrid and now face-to-face. And so they've also been talking a lot about these moment-to-moment shifts that they've been experiencing. But as we've been beginning these conversations together, the first question that I've been asking folks is, what was your journey to critical media literacy? Because I think, as we know, in the spirit of Paulo Freire, we have to think about what brings us to this work. Why are we here? We oftentimes are asked, what is our research? But I want to know, what are our passions? What drive them? And these teachers are certainly some of the most passionate individuals I've ever had the privilege of meeting. And so we've been talking about that first. And then we've been wrestling with the idea of how do we define or describe critical media literacy? As we know, it is both theory and practice. And as teachers, teaching is inherently a political act. And so as we know, this is something that is a part of our being. We can't unsee it. And these teachers have been talking a lot about this. And as experts in the field, I've been asking educators, what supports do they need? And this ties in with what Karen's been bringing to us about, what can we do when, as we see again with a resolution just like this, how is already, since this resolution has been passed, beginning to be co-opted by for-profit companies that are striving to make critical media literacy extremely prescriptive and at times limited in the level of creativity and autonomy that teachers can utilize in the classroom. And these teachers are on the front lines as they're striving to figure this work out together as they're leading in their schools. And so we've been thinking at it from a federal, state, and district level perspective and have been bridging our ideas together. Additionally, it's important to note that the bulk of these educators are already entering from a space of formal training and informal training with critical media literacy. It's important to note that they attribute much of their training and work to the phenomenal Dr. Jeff Scher and the work of Dr. Douglas Kellner, especially their critical media literacy practitioner guide. And I will share a link in the chat and in just a little bit because it's an extremely instrumental tool. Students at UCLA that are training to become teachers or in the education major and minor, if they're in a critical media literacy course, are also using this as really a jumping off point and as a toolkit, as a space to go back towards as they're developing their ideas and thinking about their future careers as educators. And so as we've been engaging and working together with these teachers, they've been touching on a lot of really what comes to us from the definition of folks from North and South America from the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas Steering Committee. They're talking about the importance of helping their students engage with media, to ask critical questions about representation, about neoliberal systems, about power structures and dynamics that so deeply shape and reproduce inequities in our society. They often comment on the power of inquiry, about generating questions, oftentimes the foundational components of the work of Paulo Freire. They often have been commenting that none of this is possible without foundational communal relationships with students that are rooted in dialogue, and what Freire talks to us about in regard to reflection and action upon the world to transform it. Folks, these are transformative teachers and students, and they are doing this work on the ground. They're asking questions about representations of class, gender, race, sexuality, and other forms of identity-based oppression that they're observing in the media. And again, this has been extremely moment to moment as these teachers have been holding space and making space with students during a quite difficult and complex time, especially with the terrain of media. They're also engaging in celebrations, though. One thing that the teachers have also been commenting on is that some of the pushback that they've received in their work is comments on, well, this is critical media literacy. Why not media literacy? I'm concerned. Is this controversial? And these teachers are saying, this is indeed necessary. This is what students are facing in their everyday lives. And so they are reminding in their school spaces that, yes, while they are challenging representations of identity in the media and questioning harmful constructs, they're also celebrating and creating positive representations so they can bring this work to their communities and beyond. And much like the steering committee's definition, for these teachers, for their why, they talk about how this perspective, this paradigm is transformative for them as teachers, but also, yes, for their students. And they comment on how it empowers them as well as their students to be more critical, caring, nurturing, and conscientious individuals. And largely these teachers, and I'll also share this in the chat in a moment, as I mentioned before, many of these educators have commented on the foundational elements of the work of Kellner and Scher, specifically using their conceptual understandings and questions alongside their students. And this is, again, we're talking kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, and in higher education, and in formal and informal educational spaces. They're using this framework. And what I love about this framework is that these questions on the right are what the teachers can use with their students. And while on the left, we have the theoretical perspective that the teacher would have a greater depth of understanding of, these questions are easily adaptable and can be used at all grade levels. And when students and teachers are engaging in questions of media, including examining neoliberal power structures, they're asking questions. Who are all the possible people who made choices? They're asking, how was this text constructed, delivered, and accessed? They're thinking about positionality, their own and others. It creates an opportunity for intergroup dialogue, asking how could this text be understood differently? They're also asking questions again about power, privilege, and pleasure, asking what values, points of views, and ideologies are represented from this text or influenced by this medium. They're asking, why was this text created or shared? So here in core concept number 5, this could also, again, go straight into what my colleagues are touching upon. As we know, media oftentimes is created with a commercial or governmental mindset or ideology in mind. And so we need to ask ourselves these questions. Why was this text created and or shared? Who benefits and who does not? And additionally, this framework provides an opportunity for teachers and students as critical media folks who are producing media, yes, but also analyzing media on a daily basis to engage with social and environmental justice, asking whom does this text advantage and or disadvantage? And so they're using these daily. And also many of the educators, another thing they have in common is that their students walk in those doors or walk in those Zoom spaces and say, well, you really ruined Netflix for me now because I can't unsee this. But with that, they can't be silenced anymore. They're becoming braver in their own understanding of themselves, self-defining who they are and who they want to be. And they're being more emboldened to take action alongside and on behalf of others. And friends, as a teacher for 10 years, I don't think there's anything more I could ask for than hearing stories like this when students can really take and be on fire for learning and be proud of who they are. And then they can take that onus and share it in their communities outside of the school space as well. And so as we continue to think about what my colleagues are also presenting, a sticking point that the educators are facing, and these are just a couple examples from some of the scholarship that 2 teachers that are teaching English language arts and social studies have been commented on, is as they're striving to disrupt the dominant curriculum that is still prescriptive within their school spaces, even if they're in a more autonomous space within, say, California or in different school districts, they're still having difficulty with the pushback. It's the same things we always see, friends. It's the pressure to teach to the test. It's teaching canonical works, westernized perspectives that are oftentimes in English language arts, a part of the Arnoldian canon, again, that are often white, male, and westernized or European perspectives, omitting the important and instrumental voices of people of color and folks from all different identities, lived experiences across class, race, gender, sexuality, and more. And then even in spaces where ethnic studies has been approved, such as certain spaces in California where it's approved as a high school requirement, they're still experiencing pushback for the very thing that they've been assigned to teach. And so they're still experiencing what we continue to see with these limited perspectives, devoid of criticality or emphasis on social issues, and again, creating a false guise of American exceptionalism. And so again, we still see this neoliberal construct within our education, within prescriptive curriculum. And despite even more spaces where there are more progressive policies that are emerging or in place, these are still the daily battles that teachers are facing and that they're striving to push back upon through the power of critical media literacy and the power of critical pedagogy. And I wanted to share this quote from a teacher that has really been sitting with me lately. And so when they talk about critical media literacy, and they talk oftentimes about critical pedagogy being a core asset for what brings them to this work in their own lives, and they say, finding Freire, it was like it was finding the language of my heart, my way of thinking and being. Introducing Freire to my students, it was like finding him all over again. And friends, I encourage you to think about how can we, as we're continuing to engage in this conference, some of us, maybe it's the first time we're coming to this work, maybe we're continuing to evolve on our journey, or maybe we've been seasoned doing this for quite some time. But for me, Palo Freire, and critical media literacy, the beauty of it is that it's always evolving. We can always look inward. We can be cognizant of our passions, and we can think about how the words and power of Palo Freire, of other critical pedagogues, bell hooks, and more, how we can bring this language, these ideas into our current moment to help us continue to address the emerging problems that we are continuing to face in education and in our everyday lives. And so I'm going to skip that for time's sake. I just wanted to leave you with a couple questions that perhaps maybe we could revisit later. The question that teachers are continuing to get asked by their students, the same ones that I'm getting asked as well as a teaching fellow with Dr. Jeff Scher, it keeps happening. How can we share critical media literacy and practice with our families, friends, and communities? How can we get CML in the hands of folks beyond the ivory tower, essentially? And then also my colleagues and I are continuing to think about this, and we want to ask to you, how do you envision critical media literacy as a people's movement? And I would like to extend specific gratitude to Kiran, to Miranda, to my fabulous committee, and to my teaching fellow, supervisor, colleague, and friend, Jeff Scher, and my family, Ricordate Chi Siete, Steve, Chris, Ben, Sarah, Justin, and my fabulous students who are the fabric and landscape of my heart from Centennial Campus Magnet Middle School, Wake STEM Early College, and UCLA. Thank you. Miranda, I'll turn it over to you.
A huge thank you to both of my co-presenters today for sharing really incredible thoughts and ideas and really setting the stage for us to have this conversation. So thank you to you both. It's an honor to be presenting today with you. So my name is Miranda McKee. To provide a bit of additional context about my work and practice, I've been working for roughly the last decade in visual arts and public programming with a focus particularly on photography. I am co-authoring a forthcoming book in collaboration with Michael Hooksman, with Sandra Jepson, I with Euthan, and also David Van Dyke, which will focus on examining the Capitol riot, in particular, digital media disinformation and democracy under attack. So I'm very passionate about visual literacy, and that drives my current research. So I'll see if I can share my screen. And hopefully you can see that. Okay, great. So just so that we're on the same page, the idea of visual literacy, which I'm talking about today, is the idea of having a set of skills that allows someone to interpret, to evaluate, and to create visual media. And in order to do so critically, one must understand and analyze the cultural context within which these images are created, but also consumed. And what I hope to do with my work is to encourage people to challenge their faith in images. And that was the goal of a workshop that I did recently, about a year ago, with Kevin Jones of Juniper Mind, that focused on visual literacy. And the focus in this particular case, the methodology that was employed was an analysis that was semiotic in nature. So understanding the signs and symbols, I collected hundreds of images that were published in mainstream media that focused on the pandemic, just as an example to understand how we can think more critically about images. So to explain a little bit of the process, I began organizing these images indexically to see what kind of ideas would emerge. And for example, this image on the right, the indexical signifiers might be the fact that we see a person in the image, that we see a cross in the image, we see steps in a room, and we see a particular kind of light. So throughout the workshop, we would look at images like this, and we would think about the symbolism. So what does the cross symbolize? Of course, it's a religious reference. What does the haze represent? And eventually we would speak about the numerous codes that would seem to influence the imagery that we see in media. So for example, in this case, what is the relationship between religious faith and our beliefs in science and technology? So those are the kind of conversations that would emerge from these discussions. And the process was meant to encourage critical thinking. So to give you an example, again, from the workshop that we did, this might look familiar to many of you. This was an image that emerged right at the beginning of the pandemic. But it's worth noting that this is an illustration. It's not a microscopic photograph. It was created by Alyssa Eckert and Dan Higgins of the American Center for Disease Control. And they were interviewed in an article and they answered questions about the process of making this image. And, they explained that they made a number of iterations, that they did different colors and different approaches before selecting this particular version. They explained that they needed to bring the invisible into view, to create something with texture that people felt that they could, be concerned about touching, to bring attention to the gravity of this situation. But in this article, they also stated that the illustration was, quote, going to have to go along with the branding, unquote. What branding? The CDC branding is like a Facebook kind of blue. It's certainly not the CDC branding that they're going with. And the concern here is that this illustration was made free to download from the CDC website at high res, which many publications needed visuals to talk about coronavirus so early in the pandemic, and we're struggling. So this, this idea of red that they chose obviously signifies things like stop, like caution, like alarm, but what else does that color scheme go with? Well, here is a not so subtle example from the Financial Times that showed up, and we can't help but wonder, is this the branding that they were speaking of? So they seem to make these kind of references very easy, and you don't have to believe necessarily that the illustrators had in mind to blame China, but you can see how the choices of two illustrators have a significant influence on how the pandemic was visualized early on around the world. And that's powerful, and these conscious decisions shouldn't go unnoticed. So that's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this critical thinking about visual literacy. So just to explain a little bit of the themes that arose from this analysis of COVID-19 coverage, I looked at a number of different publications like The Guardian, The New York Times, Canada's Global News, and started to pull out the repetition. So in this case, these three examples really speak about the challenges that were facing us during the pandemic. So things like the idea that we are going to war against an enemy. And so we heard a lot of rhetoric about war, the front line and so forth, but we also saw that in the visuals. Furthermore, there was this intent to blame someone, to find someone responsible for the pandemic. And we saw misplaced blame abound. So whether it was blame against China, like we've just discussed, or against racialized individuals or against the poor, that really became evident in the visuals. And then third, there was this idea of technology as a savior, whether it was developing the vaccine or even things like working from home and Zoom as a alternative that would help with social distancing. All of these things became visually apparent. Three other themes that arose were more about our own personal experience. So, for example, images of the apocalypse. Before the pandemic, we never really saw entire huge cities empty with no cars on the streets or people walking around, and suddenly it felt like this was the apocalypse. That was the imagery that we were seeing. But also agoraphobia. The media really grabbed hold of this fear of crowds. And so you would either see images of big concerts and a bit of blame, putting towards those people, or the opposite, empty streets again. And then this really problematic idea that we're all in this together, even though the pandemic was affecting different communities in significantly different ways. There was this idea of unity that was visually being presented, whether it was, elbow bumps or everyone on the balcony singing together. So I'd like to come back to this idea of blame, because this is something that was problematic and is helpful to really deconstruct when talking about visual literacy. So this is a newscast, the global news in Canada that's close to home for me. And this was at a time when, these are screenshots from a video. This was at a time when Australia and New Zealand were closing their borders to quote unquote foreigners in an effort to slow the spread. And as the video voiceover said the word foreigners, we see a woman on the right enter the airport wearing a chador, and a couple on the left of Asian descent pictured in the imagery. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that this is what visual blame looks like, and we need to call it out. We need to call it for what it is. So if we go to the next slide, in this same video, this was when the death toll in Italy was really rising beyond China. So it was a significant moment. the death toll was rising, and yet the imagery that we see on the right is of elderly people that are just in a makeshift hospital space. So this is where I wanted to start talking about the labor of death. And in COVID, obviously, death needs to be talked about by the media, but who bears that labor of visually representing it? This is a problem. It tends to be borne by racialized individuals alone. And so the next image that I'd like to share is of an individual that is deceased. So if there's anyone that wants to take a visual break, I just wanted to give a warning in advance. So this is an image run by the New York Times of a man in Wuhan that was collapsed on the street. He was indeed deceased. The healthcare workers have their back to the victim. The photo contains enough information about the environment that if you lived in that neighborhood, you might recognize the location, you might even recognize the man. No one is cradling this man. His face is not hidden or protected. It's a very cold depiction of a loss of life. If we compare this to another image by the same publication, the New York Times, this image was taken in New York of a funeral director, very literally cradling the body of someone deceased from COVID-19. And the caption itself says that there's a small area of the photo that was altered. It was blurred to obscure the identity of the victim on the body tag. So why is it that when we run an image that's from Wuhan, we see the face of the victim, but here we go to lengths to protect identity and respect anonymity? So why is it that white or American bodies are spared of this labor of demonstrating death, and why does it fall to racialized individuals? So that's an important conversation that I think to have. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was really, why is it important to talk about these things, and what can we do about it? As critical consumers of media, I think we can call it out, but also as educators, I believe we can provide our students with the tools to recognize these issues and call them out as well. So we see this in some cases where, for example, online, we have people that are calling it out, right? I just went too far, hang on. So this is a tweet from Nana Kofi Akwa, who is a Ghanaian journalist and photographer and a champion of women's rights in the African continent. And he really asked that question: why is it that the photojournalists, when they parachute into the African continent, are they not using the same kind of care that they would when these things happen in Italy? And so, this idea that dignity is a fundamental human right and not a privilege of the few, I thought was quite poignant. So also, this is another example of calling it out, right? So this is a tweet where The Economist ran an image of a woman in a burqa with the headline, "The arrival of COVID-19 was expected. The spread of radical Islam was more of a surprise." This is blatant Islamophobia that's been run under the guise of COVID-19 news. And The Economist quietly deleted the post, but not before others like Mcdad Versi called it out. And calling it out here actually creates an archive of accountability, which is important because in pursuit of holding truth to power in a slippery world of social media, where people can do and say terrible things and delete it when it suits them, this archive becomes quite important. So this, I thought, was an opportunity to shift to the Capitol riot conversation that I've been looking into with my fellow researchers. So as everyone I think will know, on January 6th, the United States Capitol experienced a riot, and Parler at the time was a social media network that catered specifically to right-wing Americans and potentially played a role in organizing the riot and the attack on American democracy, which is why the suppliers that supplied the servers for Parler actually removed all of that information after the insurrection, but not before it was scraped by a user named Donk MB and organized by the folks at ProPublica, which is the slide that I'm showing you now. That's what their website looks like based on the insurrection. And they organized all of the videos, the thousands of videos that were uploaded by rioters who were at the Capitol, really self-surveilling in a way. And what I found interesting about this is here at the corner where it says, send us a tip. So it's not just about creating an archive, but also a conversation about, look at these images with us and tell us what you see. And that collective effort, I think, to hold people accountable for their actions is really interesting, particularly as it's being done through media. So, of course, that brings us to even more recent conversations to acknowledge, that social media platforms are also perpetuating misinformation. So there was a recent study by the NYU and the University of Grenoble-Alpes in France that found from August 2020 to Jan 2021, news publishers that were known for putting out misinformation received 6 times more likes and shares and interactions on Facebook. And that study was actually shut down by Facebook for a few reasons, I'm guessing. So on the surface, some of these images that we saw emerging from the Capitol riot, Jake and Jelly and the costumes, or Adam Johnson happily stealing Nancy Pelosi's lectern, these images focusing on these images right at the beginning when we started to learn about the Capitol riot, take away potentially from the seriousness of the events that unfolded, particularly when we know, and it later came to be known, that many people were injured and feared for their lives that day. So this brings me to my last section, where what I really wanted to talk about is the whole story. So as photographers, I believe we can provide a more nuanced reflection of the whole story. And as publishers, we can support a nuanced storytelling. And we can be formal publishers if we work for a publication, but we're also all informal publishers by sharing on our own social media platforms. But what does the whole story look like? So I'll wrap up with these last 2 images. This is a photo that was taken in Dubai by a photographer named Mohammed Samji, who was commissioned by the Washington Post. The story was meant to investigate a number of expatriates that relocated to Dubai for work, lost their jobs due to the pandemic, and found themselves homeless, living in a park and sleeping in a park. So this image is exactly what the Washington Post was looking for when they commissioned this work. But what I argue is that alone this image does not tell the story in a complete manner. So this man's name is Jide. Originally from Nigeria, he moved to Dubai to provide an income for his family. Although he lost his job and he was forced to sleep in the park, what became clear from a conversation that he had with the photographer was that he had this faith and determination to stick it out, to find another job, to provide for his wife and 2 children. And I think it's photos like this one that show that feeling and that emotion in the story, and tells the story with nuance, with respect, and with dignity. This is the kind of visual storytelling that I believe we need to support in mainstream media. We need to seek out this kind of visual storytelling that provides a more complete picture. And we need to also call it out when these stories fall short. And I think that through visual literacy education, we can equip learners with the ability to do that, both as producers, as publishers, and as consumers. So that is all that I wanted to share on visual literacy, and thank you for allowing me to share that with you today. Thank you to Andrea and Kiran, and thank you also to Michael Hooksman, who's been super supportive of this work, and also Iowith. I'll stop sharing.
Wow, incredible. Incredible. Thank you so much, all 3 of you, Kiran, Andrea, Miranda, for your sharing of your brilliant work and ideas. As you were speaking, people had questions that they posted in the chat and thoughts that they wanted to share. So I will take us through some of those. Some are interconnected, and some are also connected to Andrea's questions that she had posed for us. So we'll hopefully have a few minutes to get to all of those. Let's start with this one because I think it's so fundamental. MG asked, Can you speak to the difference between media literacy and critical media literacy?
All right.
Any one of y'all that would like to jump in?
I would like to jump in. That's a very interesting question, and thank you so much for the question. I think the main focus for critical media literacy is to center practices and thought processes that allow you to engage with and question structures of power. Media literacy, when used in isolation of the word critical, might be thought of as competencies, technical competencies that allow you to use media. So it has a utilitarian driven notion to a large extent if you don't infuse it with critical literacy at its center. And it could be restricted to the idea of developing competencies to produce content, to circulate content, to engage. But what is it about engaging meaningfully? What is it about engaging critically? What is it about using sensitive language? How do you build in sensitivity in the kind of content you create and the kind of conversations you engage in? And how do you hold a space of discomfort when there are these differing opinions and ideas and you still want to have a constructive dialogue? I think all of those questions are addressed when you use the term critical along with media literacy.
Thank you. Did either one of y'all want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think really similar to what Kiran's describing. It's truly, in my perspective, and also what many of the educators have been sharing in terms of the differences, is that it's really that emphasis on social and environmental justice, on thinking about media, like the different photographs and images that Miranda was sharing. Having students ask themselves questions about, who created this, who made these choices, who does it help, who does it harm, and then how can we use our voices to challenge dis or mis or harmful representations that we're seeing, and what can we do? And so it's really that emphasis of criticality, whereas similar to what Kiran's saying, I really deeply agree that media literacy, in my perspective, and often from many of these teachers, is more focused on competencies or tools, oftentimes like different methods or approaches of fact checking and reading. But for example, it might be fact checking without an examination on questions of subjectivity, questions of social and environmental justice, and it focuses more on a skill versus a skill that can essentially create transformative change or endeavor towards social justice.
And a really big piece of that is the action piece that critical media literacy asks of educators, to have students and create space for students to make their own media, to rewrite reality, to tell their own stories from their own perspectives, to challenge the narratives, and also to imagine new narratives. And critical media literacy is very explicit about asking students to create so that there is possibility and hope within the analysis of the power structures that exist in our world, and an acknowledgement that they're constructed and we can reconstruct them and reimagine them in our own ways. And that really connects to some of the next questions that our audience has been asking, related to, first, Magda's question was, how can we start working with CML with our students from school and university? And Justin and Alexandra kind of added on to that, saying, how do we use critical media literacy when we're working with our students to hold space for students during traumatic events like the Capitol riot that Miranda talked about? And how can we use media literacy to help us identify media's role in defining the event as traumatic or not, or relevant or not, in framing the event or reframing it. So what are some of y'all's thoughts on that?
I really like the example that you had, Andrea, of the questions that you're asking students. I think that's a really great way to begin thinking critically, is to encourage your students to stop and say, well, who made this? What are the potential reasons that they made this that may be nefarious or motivated by the hegemony and the cultural context, or the socioeconomical context that's influencing what it is I'm consuming. I think those questions are really important and really set the stage for those conversations to begin, and those reflections to take place.
And thank you for dropping that link into the chat where you can find the guide for that and a bunch of resources.
I just wanted to add on that in the work with the teachers, they've been commenting on first about building coalition, building community, understanding your students first, and really cultivating respect and rapport to really take the time to build that trust first, to be vulnerable with our students and to help them be able to see us too. So very much so going against what we oftentimes hear as educators, don't smile till a holiday season or things like that. No, about building community and really truly making ourselves vulnerable to this process of being co-constructors, co-facilitators with our students. And so they oftentimes talk about that as a piece first. And then really kind of inviting students to bring media into the classroom, to share the ways that they produce media, why and how do they do that, and then to co-design lessons with their students, because as we know, media is changing constantly in how we create it. And so, for example, I might not use a certain platform, but if it's important to my students and if that's how they're engaging with their worlds, then I want to take the time to learn that with them, to see how they're represented on that medium. And then let's talk together and to find a way that we can create together how they want to be represented and how they want to share their voices and ideas.
That really speaks to the question I'd like to close this out with. And this is for everyone, audience participants as well. How do you, or how can we envision critical media literacy as a people's movement? What does that look like for us?
I'll jump in, but I know that my co-panelists will have ideas too. I mean, I think there are multiple ways to create community and space around these conversations. And so much of that has emerged from this conference in the salons that Amina is creating, where we're able to see film being created, art being created, and space being created to have these conversations that push back against imbalances in power. And I think that's what's really valuable, is these spaces. And it needs to happen from educators, because we are part of an institution and that can be problematic, but it does have to happen in non-traditional spaces too, I think, where we need to create learning, whether people are formalized as students that are attending university or attending school of any kind, but also in museum spaces, in cinemas, and in other, in living rooms and dining rooms, and all of the places in between, where we should be able to have these conversations with one another respectfully, but able to disagree and push back and question.
Any closing thoughts from either of our two speakers about this question of critical media literacy as a people's movement?
I'll just add one thing. I think the entire label and the kind of engagements we have created and sustained with the phrase media literacy is very formal, and we need to look for media literacy beyond formal spaces and beyond educators and teachers who have the qualifications, assumedly, to conduct media education and literacy. A very brilliant example would be the protest movements and the kind of solidarity building, organizing, creating this dialogue about what is racial justice, what is justice for everybody, happens at the grassroots with so many cyber feminists, cyber activists coming together. That's a very important space for media literacy. So I think that there is some productive tension inherent in the idea of looking at media literacy from beyond formal structures and practices and learning principles.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, everyone who participated today. Justin has just posted a link in the chat where we can keep the conversation going. And I do also want to note to anyone who just popped into the room that we're going to close this session out and the 5:30 session will start shortly, but we'll try to log out of this room and then come back in. Thank you one more time to our presenters. Thank you to our conference organizers for making this beautiful experience happen for all of us. And I appreciate you all for joining us for this hour, for this incredible session. Thank you all and have a great rest of your time at the conference.
Thank you to you, Anand, for being a wonderful moderator and incredibly supportive and for contributing to the conversation. It was really wonderful.
Yes, Anand, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Miranda. Bye-bye. Bye, Mommy and Daddy. I love you. Analysis.